Today's topic is decoupling the mobile enterprise, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means from an enterprise perspective here in a moment. It has a lot of kind of connotations, I think, and interesting meanings, but we'll go into that. And with Agilex, we one of our specialties is enterprise mobile development, both on the application side and on the enterprise mobility side. And by the way, we're probably the only sponsor that has one of these. So you should really check out these airplanes because they're amazing and they're right out there. I thought that was funny. So how did we get here in this crazy world of mobility? And I thought I'd begin with like my personal story, kind of how I arrived. And my journey started back in the 90s, starting out with HTML. I was like, oh, this is amazing, GIFs. I was all excited about that. And then about a year later, frames. I was like, you can scroll content in frames. This is great. And then, proceeded along to like portals and e-commerce sites. And I don't know if y'all are similar, but around 2006, I started to get a little bored. I was like, another portal. Just thinking about doing something different. And then, all of a sudden, boom, 2008 comes and everybody's excited, right? Everybody's rejuvenated with mobility. And that's kind of where I was. I was just really ecstatic about it and excited. And I was riding that wave for maybe, a year or so, and then started my first mobile project after that. And right away in the kickoff meeting, I started noticing something, and it was people were getting mad. They were getting angry, and I was like, what is going on here? I mean, you would have comments like, we're not doing any native development here. It's all mobile web. And I was going, oh okay, that's fine. We'll just do mobile web, no problem. And I grinded through that project, got through the end. It was something else. And I was like, that was just an aberration. The next one, can't be possibly like that. And sure enough, I started out the next one, same thing. People were upset. They were angry. And, I took a step back, okay, what's going on here? What is the root cause of all this anxiety of these customers? And what I figured out was that mobility was, in so many ways, a fundamental disruption to IT, to what IT had been spending years developing, which was primarily a fixed desktop experience with a secure network perimeter, with a standardized process for development. And now you have, these heterogeneous devices, you have issues with security, authentication. There was like a mobile app debate going on. Should be HTML5, should be native. So everybody was all bothered by this, and it was infringing upon their domains. And so that's when I was thinking, okay, that's the key. That's what we have to address. And with that, that's where we came up with this concept of decoupling. And what is decoupling, and what exactly does it mean? And essentially it means, in sort of a broad general way, is separating these key layers of the mobile enterprise while maintaining security to get the advantages of mobility, to drive business value, but at the same time give IT the peace and comfort that they need to maintain their operations, their security posture, their development, and all of that. And by decoupling, it's not like a pure decoupling. There's degrees of it. It's not a complete separation. And some of the advantages of it are things like speed to market. You can just do things quicker by going to the cloud, for example. Security can actually be enhanced by decoupling in many cases. You can take advantage of the digital ecosystem of social, mobile APIs. There's decentralized IT control. IT has been largely about centralized control. Well, decoupling is a little different. Continuous integration is part of that, whether you're doing it in a cloud or on premise. It's about APIs. So there's a lot more that I think that's covered there, but those are some of the things. So it sounds kind of easy conceptually, but exactly how do you go about it? And what are the steps involved? And so starting out, when you're approaching a customer to embark on an enterprise mobility program with this concept of decoupling in mind, I would say if you do nothing else, the most important thing is the vision. And it sounds so fundamental and basic, but it's actually, I think, one of the most difficult things to achieve. And it comes from the CIO and the VP level, where they're aligning the IT portfolios, the businesses, to this consistent vision of mobility. Some other aspects to it are the procurement. How are we going to buy this service? And there's several models that government organizations, commercial organizations will embark upon. Some have formal vehicles and contracts. Others approach it from a crowdsourcing methodology or standpoint. There's some who home grow it in-house or do kind of a combination of those two. So procurement is definitely involved in that. And then lastly, the first stage is strategy and architecture. That is step one. And it's always interesting when you look at developing a enterprise mobile strategy. If you're like me, you get all these newsletters and you get kind of the hot topics of the day. And if you were to read them, it seems like it's just about MDM and HTML5, and they're always like these catchy headlines and sponsored by or something like that. And in actuality, it's actually way beyond that. And I think it's due in part to mobility touches pretty much every aspect of the enterprise, from governance to data to networking, telecommunications. And when you're looking at a mobile strategy, you really need to think about all those different layers or pillars, if you will. And these are some of what we consider to be some of the key pillars. And this is not like the ultimate list. There's variations on this, but these are certainly some of the key ones. And developing the strategy, I think, it involves kind of two main activities. One is this gap analysis of all these key layers to understand, okay, where's the current state of where the enterprise exists? And then what are these change requirements that are needed to decouple to generate value? So there's an infrastructure task that is involved. And then secondly, there's really a needs assessment where you're understanding from the business what are the needs out there that mobility can achieve and help solve and drive value. So you do those things kind of in tandem, and out of that, you basically reveal the potential apps and these potential infrastructure change requirements. And going through the pillars, what we'll do in the time we have is go through each of these and look at some of the key aspects of these pillars and what are some of the decoupling tactics or some of the big picture items that we think are needed. There's 8 of them here. There's a mobile application development framework, mobile device management, enterprise app store, governance, mobile infrastructure. Security is obviously a big one. There's an O&M component to it. And then lastly, enterprise mobile data. So that's the strategy. The other aspect is the architecture. And so many customers that I'm engaged with, they want to kind of short shrift the strategy and architecture phase. And it's probably the most critical part of the program. They're like, just do it in 6 weeks, do it in 8 weeks, just hurry up and get it done. And there's not a lot you can do about that at times. To do a formal architecture takes a long period of time. So the question becomes, okay, how can we actually deliver something that's of value to the customer in a condensed time frame? And there's a couple of approaches. One approach that we've taken is this concept of like a pattern architecture, where you're developing these consistent patterns that can be used by EA groups and organizations to define a mobile solution. And this is not like an exhaustive list, but it's some of the major patterns that you'll come across. Application patterns, whether it's a mobile web, hybrid application, native, those are obviously known. There's connectivity patterns with SOA and web services, telecommunication patterns, for example, which is cellular, all the cellular spectrums, Wi-Fi. So you can develop these patterns that can be almost mix and match, like a Chinese menu, to use to architect mobile solutions. And there's a lot of great existing architectures that are out there as well that I think are actually very useful and can be very helpful guides for an organization. There's some by OMB, DISA, and NIST that we reference that do a lot and address a lot of the security areas as well. So we use those as well. So those are just some approaches for the architecture phase. So once we've gone through developing this strategy and this architecture, how do you plan the change? How do you implement, both mobile application development and all these changes that are required? And this is this crazy diagram that you can hardly see because of all the light is called the Scaled Agile Framework. And what this is, it's taking the Agile approach and applying it, up through the various levels of an organization, not only at a project level, but at a program and portfolio level. So you can actually use Agile techniques like Scrum and Kanban to plan a portfolio and to develop a program. And so up at the top, basically what comes out of this, and this is just kind of me sort of paraphrasing and touching on some of the areas, but you develop architectural and business epics at a CIO level that helps them to define the investment that's going to be required. And those then get generated into programs. And at a program level, you have Scrum of Scrums and release trains where you'll have multiple Scrum teams working on complex and sophisticated programs. And you'll have architectural UI teams who are working at a program level. And then obviously at a project level, you'll have smaller teams working projects and doing incremental releases. So that's kind of the safe approach. It's not the only way that you can use to plan for change and all the requirements, but we think it's a good approach. So the first pillar that we have, a mobile applications development framework. So what exactly does this mean? And it's essentially about the processes, the tools, and the resources to support mobile application development. And you'll notice here it's not really addressing like should you use HTML5 or native or hybrid apps. That's part of it, but it's more of these larger areas. And the way I look at it is that the client app is often the easy part. It's all the back-end development, because so often what we find is that a lot of these systems and the data and everything else isn't even there to begin with, or it's not optimized for a mobile app. So you've got to do all this work on the back end, building out web services, testing, setting up a CI environment that's required for application development. So the goal of this is to set up this infrastructure and this environment to facilitate distributed application development. among, it could be for, teams that are in-house, it could be for development teams, externally, but you're basically developing all those things. And some of the larger areas that we look at to address are, web services is obviously a big one, how that integrates with, an existing service-oriented architecture. Continuous integration and agile engineering. How can we use agile and agile integration, test-driven development for mobile application development? Obviously, standards, best practices, and your strategy, defining those key standards that are critical for application development, whether it's UI, UX, caching, even web services is part of it. The development tools and libraries, defining, okay, what frameworks do we want to use? What libraries do we want to offer for the enterprise? Testing is obviously huge. If you're in the business, a lot of folks will say, well, mobile development's not really any different than web. And in some ways that's true, but in other ways there's a few critical differences. And I'll say testing is one of those. It is more difficult to test and do QA on mobile applications, mobile solutions. Build servers, caching, these are some of the main areas that, and there's certainly more than this list, but these are some of the larger ones. So agile engineering is all about development. And development, can certainly be done on premise, whether you're inside a customer's data center. But the cloud is definitely faster. And you can, more quickly and I would say even more cost effectively spin up infrastructure and environments in the cloud, than you can on premise. That's not to say you can't optimize, an on-premise and CI environment to do things quickly, but typically, the cloud can be a much faster way. But either way, either approach, teams should really develop using continuous integration and implement the necessary infrastructure to support, these multiple distributed teams, whether they're building native apps or mobile web apps, what have you. If you're going to go to the cloud, it is important to conform and follow existing code promotion, testing, and CNA processes of a customer. And there's certainly ways that you can do that. Some of the critical features that we look at in creating like this mobile applications environment, a code repository or a code library, whether you're using Subversion or Git, is key because you want to have all that control, version control, and the ability to look up code and all that. Virtual machines with IDEs. We'll put IDEs on virtual machines that can be used, and they'll have these things called starter kits, which are templates that will offer developers a way to get started so they can see how things should be done. A lot of continuous integration and a DevOps concept where we'll use Jenkins to do a lot of our builds and manage our pipeline, Node and Grunt, using those for our testing, especially for JavaScript and mobile web. Database virtualization is an interesting one. Everybody I think is knows about VMs and using VMs for servers, but what about data? Data's a little different, and there's some new technologies, or maybe not so new, that are used to do database virtualization, where you can rapidly develop and deploy virtualized databases that can be used for testing, very easily, because it's actually very difficult to replicate test environments for data. So that's another key area that you can use. Application lifecycle management, which are things like using agile project management software, whether it's the Atlassian suite with Jira, version 1, having all that in place, I think is critical for your teams. Your build scripts, your testing environment. And it's interesting for internal deployments through an enterprise app store, you'll want to account for that. So how are you going to have a test app store and do test provisioning of your apps? So that's all part of this agile engineering approach. So service implementation, SOA, that's obviously another big one. I think it's well understood, REST and JSON are kind of the flavor of the moment, if you will. But to me, the main area to address is infrastructures and customers. They've spent all this investment on building out this SOA infrastructure, and it's here to ESB or not ESB. And a lot of them have purchased, say, the IBM WebSphere suite to handle web services. And the question becomes, okay, how do you integrate with that or not? And the trend, I think, seems to be more toward like self-service versus like governance. But a key question, I think, for enterprises is how do we leverage that existing investment to support mobility? And I think there's ways to do that. And some of the key areas that you'll address are obviously, messaging, services, user experience, data, use of a service registry, your service orchestration, business rules, identity and security. Those are some of the key ones that you'll address. Some of the decoupling trends, and this is an interesting one. SOA as a concept, you'll hear a lot of technologists and CTOs just kind of rip on SOA nowadays, saying it's it's dated, it's past. I don't know if that's true or not. I think it may be more evolving versus being defunct. But some of the issues around SOA, the use of registries, I think, are, I've seen a lot of registries that aren't well used or used at all. There's typically a lot of overhead in trying to maintain, a SOA governance model. Some ESBs, you'll hear that developers say they're just not flexible enough. I need, flexible, lightweight web services, and ESBs are just not that. Dynamic discovery is difficult. Complexity makes it difficult, and a lot of the service standards are changing. They've evolved since the early 2000s now, with RESTful. And it's expensive. It's expensive to have, multiple API managers for, whatever the ratio is to APIs. So developing, common APIs that can be accessed and consumed by app developers is key. And with governance, you want to reduce your API management with self-service, whether you're implementing something like, something like Apogee or a Reg Manager that promotes self-service and discovery, among your customers and your development community. And one of the approaches, certainly what we try to emphasize with a lot of our customers is you don't have to throw away your entire investment. You can consider a hybrid model and this concept of a mobile hub. Some call it, an adapter. But essentially the concept is that there's these common mobile services that pretty much every app and mobile solution is going to use. Active Directory is one that's typical. Geolocation. And there's others that can be developed in a mobile hub. And the hub can be developed with application servers that works in conjunction with an enterprise services bus or some kind of gateway. So both the hub and an ESB can actually be used for both specific business services and these common services. So that's up to you as the integrator to figure that out and to understand that and make those determinations. Whenever you're considering these implementations, understanding like the internal and external enclave is also different, because a lot of customers will set up their infrastructure where the internal enclave will actually be quite different than the external. And so there's a little bit of consideration there as well. You can use existing SOA appliances for atomic web services. One technique and approach I've seen is where you take the IBM suite with the use of data power, producing like atomic web services in XML. You can still use that, but then leverage the mobile hub for more flexible, lightweight services using REST. API management software, which we've talked about, I think is really great. You as a developer can go in and select and mash up APIs. And one of the examples of that I like is Twitter. They reduced, Twitter uses that, and this is not a plug for Apogee, but I find it a pretty effective commercial, if you will. Twitter has about 5 API managers per 100,000 APIs. It's just stunning what they've done for self-service. And so you can really use that, I think, very effectively. And then OAuth 2 for authentication. So those are some just approaches for how you can use a existing infrastructure, but yet tweak it for mobility. The next kind of big area are these things, mobile application development platforms, otherwise I like to call them MEAPs. That's what they were before, which was mobile enterprise application platforms. I just like the name MEAPs. I think it's kind of funny. IT departments, they love these things. I mean, they think they're the greatest things on earth, and most developers just can't stand them. So I think it's funny, but eventually IT departments come to realize they're maybe not so great. But essentially what a MEAP is, if you're not familiar with it, it does several things. One is that it has some MDM capabilities where you can actually manage devices, MDM and MAM. It has some MDM and mobile application functionality, built into it. It typically has a standardized mobile app development environment where you can develop once and then deploy to multiple platforms. It has, that cross-platform publishing capability, which I just mentioned. It can typically do like versioning and updates to applications supposedly easily, but oftentimes I find that's not necessarily the case. So it does a lot of those things. And I don't want to say, not to consider them, but there are some issues I think that everyone should kind of be aware of if you go down that road. One is that there's a lot of free alternatives other than, say, the IBM Worklights of the world, or Sybase, not Sybase now, but I think SAP, the Afaria platform. But there's a lot of free alternatives out there, whether it's PhoneGap or some other compiler that can do that for cross-platform publishing. Upgrade issues and release management. Whenever there's a new version of an OS, like iOS 7, you basically have to upgrade the platform to support all those APIs. And there's always issues with that. You are dependent upon the MEAP vendor to do all that. And if they don't do it, essentially you cannot upgrade your apps. So that's an important area. And it's not only upgrading the apps that you have to do, but you have a release management issue with the software itself. So you have to basically upgrade the MEAP platform. So there are some technology restrictions that accompany a MEAP that you have to be aware of. I still find you need developers if you're going to invest in one. You're still going to have developers who have some expertise in native development and mobile web, especially the more complex your applications get. These platforms, tend to do, pretty well with like simple apps, but the more complex your apps get, the more difficult it is to do all that cross-platform publishing. And they typically run a little slower, but those are just some of the issues. Some of these can be overcome, some are more problematic, and they're getting better. The Worklight product, I would say IBM, out of all of them, has actually done a lot in the past year or so with the new release of Worklight that is actually pretty flexible. So they're coming along. They deserve watching and research. And related to MEAPs is MDM. And MDMs are kind of in the same boat. They're getting better, but they're still problematic. And I've had, architects, I asked an architect, well, what do you think about MDMs? And it's like, they all stink. That's what he was telling me. And, why is that? Well, MDMs are actually a very different animal for IT departments for a number of reasons. And the main reason is that they are actually going outside the network to do critical functions, whether it's calling, Apple or Google. So you got to open up all these ports to enable that, as well as, connecting with the device. So security tends to get, pretty bent out of shape about them. There's some additional hardware often required, like DNS servers, for example, are often required for it. Just as there's upgrade issue with MEEPs, there's upgrade issues with MDM. It's the same thing. If there's a new release of an OS, you have to upgrade the MDM, and it's dependent upon the MDM vendor to do that. Setting up dev test environments is another big one. It's absolutely critical that customers set up development environments for MDMs so they can test if there's upgrades and what that effect is going to be. Some of the integration with other infrastructure is also very important, like telecommunications, TIM-WIM, telecommunications expense management, wireless expense management, Active Directory. It's important that all that gets integrated. It's actually kind of challenging to do. But otherwise, you're faced with the situation where you have to manage, multiple systems to effectively manage a device. So it's ideal if you can integrate with that infrastructure and then staff it and then configure it. There's basically two types of deployments that you can do for MDM. Cloud, obviously, there's a lot of hosted solutions, and then there's on-premise. And a lot of research can give you a good overview of the landscape. The Gartner Magic Quadrant can give you all the leading vendors, if you will. And the main thing is, I think the priorities and the requirements will vary by organization. Some organizations will look at BYOD as a priority. And that's kind of a very different thing if you're only doing, say, furnace devices. So it's important to understand, all the various requirements. And some of the main categories that you want to evaluate and assess are obviously security, the ability to do whitelisting, blacklisting. I would even throw in mobile application management as part of that, provisioning, profile management, enrollment in the actual MDM. App Store comes along typically with most MDMs. Reporting is big, alerting, and then just ability to do compliance and monitoring of devices. MDM, like MEEPs, can also work with containers and other mobile application management platforms. And a lot of customers will use both of those to secure data, to secure applications. There are, I think, some issues with trying to mash up those two technologies. Your cost per device typically increase quite a bit. If you're going to use a container like Fixmo, for example, or a Good or something like that with an MDM, your cost per device increase quite a bit because you've got the cost of the container and then the cost per device for the MDM. The UI and UX of containers, of the apps that are in containers, are typically not all that great. Like if you look at Goods, like Goods email client, for example, it's not all that great. Some of them are better, but a lot of customers are kind of turned off by that. Some of them you have to rebuild the apps or redistribute the container every time you make a change to the app, which is not ideal. It's a lot of overhead that you've got to take on. A lot of customers are looking at not doing containers, but application wrapping. Being able to securely wrap an application and secure data through mobile application management software like Aperion. Mobile Iron actually has some MAM capabilities that they've recently rolled out. So they'll look at that as an alternative. And I think one of the more interesting trends is around virtualization. And I haven't seen, there's been some conversation about virtualization, but I know VMware is pushing that heavily right now, where they can just have these virtual clients using hypervisors. And I saw a guy from VMware showed me that, look, I can just switch from Android to iOS right here. And it was pretty amazing. So I think there's still going to be some evolution yet, within this space. Enterprise App Store, obviously it comes with most MDM software packages, but just as there's a lot of requirements and categories of MDM, there's a lot with enterprise app stores. You want a good customer experience, ability to pull in public apps from Google or from iTunes, wherever, ability for ratings and comments, the ability to have like multi-platforms, so not just iOS, but also Android and others. The ability to push updates. So considering the full constellation of requirements for app stores, I think is also very, very important. So that's kind of the mobile application framework pillar, which is pretty broad. It's probably one of the biggest ones. I think it's what most customers kind of like gravitate towards and focus on. But there's other ones that I think are also pretty important. Like I would throw in governance. Governance is a big one. And there's several ways that you can approach governance. And I tend to look at existing kind of best practices, like ITIL and COBIT, I think are really good governance models. And any governance model that you establish, it should really address kind of the key areas, and these are from COBIT, and I think they still apply for mobility, which is in delivery, strategy, strategic alignment, resource management, ability to manage risk, and then performance management. So these key areas typically come as part of a governance model. And some of the newer thinking around governance is this concept of a managed service, where you have almost this supply and demand model. And it really is kind of like that, where customers have demand for applications, for devices, for infrastructure, for data even, and then it's the job of IT to provide the supply. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. And I think ITIL can be, if y'all are familiar with ITIL, it's really looking at IT as a managed service. And it addresses strategy generation, service design, transition, operations, and using things like a service catalog that can become an effective ordering mechanism for customers. And it's important to determine and define, okay, what's the structure for our governance? How are we going to manage that? And typically most organizations that I've seen will have like this two-tiered approach where you have executive governance at a CIO and VP level, and then you'll have functioning working groups who are working with delivery, working with resource management, whether it's meeting the demands for apps, for devices, what have you. And governance can integrate, with existing review boards. A lot of organizations have existing SDLC policies and processes, change control boards, architectural review boards. Mobility can typically work pretty well with those. So this is an area that you don't necessarily have to decouple. You can still, I think, run it fairly seamlessly with the organization, but they have to adapt a little bit. BYOD is an interesting one. That is kind of a new area for governance, and there's obviously the security aspect of BYOD and making sure their data is secure, but some of the governance and policies around BYOD are actually more challenging. A lot of customers don't realize, we have to have legal policies developed. We have to think about things like adoption and stipends. How are we going to incentivize people to use their personal devices? And it's kind of a big deal. So the recent the federal CIO put out about a year and a half ago a policy or handbook on BYOD that's actually quite good. It's pretty comprehensive. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to look at that. A third pillar is infrastructure. And infrastructure is kind of a all-encompassing term, but I think here, for our purposes, we're looking at it in regards to telecommunications primarily. You can also throw in your hosting environment, identity, disaster recovery, and these other large aspects of the enterprise. And it is, I think, important to understand, what are the wireless and cellular protocols that are supported, both within the infrastructure and even outside. If you're looking at, an organization wanting to do an app externally, what are the cellular standards that we're going to support? Internally, what's our Wi-Fi coverage look like at our facilities? The last thing you want to do is roll out an app and nobody can really use it, or you're not designing it correctly for things like offline storage because there's intermittent coverage. So it is important to understand from a network perspective, all of that. Network access control is actually another big one. And it's sort of related to MDM, and it works with MDM typically. But what it does is authenticate devices. And some of the products that you find out there are the Cisco ICE, for example, their identity services engine. There's a few others, like Forescout is another one. But these serve to authenticate devices. And that's, if you ask security officers, like, what's your number one worry? A lot of them will come back and say, device authentication, by far. And that's what NAC is designed to control and help alleviate. We couldn't get through this without talking about, the cloud and all of what it does and can do. And I do think it instills both fear and excitement among customers, and it is key to a lot of decoupling trends. They do seem the cloud does seem particularly well suited to mobile apps, obviously, especially when you're considering things like agility, speed to market, even lower cost, and I think security can actually be enhanced with the cloud. But some of the things that I think are not necessarily understood about the cloud or developers and organizations don't consider are things like these enterprise services. And what I've seen a lot of developers and organizations do is they'll develop in the cloud, whether it's Amazon or wherever, and then they'll try to bring the app on-premise into a data center. And lo and behold, the thing doesn't work. Works perfectly in the cloud, but all of a sudden it bombs. And why is that? Well, there's things with the enterprise, these enterprise services, whether it's VPNs or access to certain protocols and ports that aren't replicated in the cloud. And development teams and IT didn't understand that. They thought we could just spin up a dev environment and servers, everything was great. But they failed to recognize that there were these other critical parts. So it's important to understand that and incorporate that in your planning. Security is another big one, obviously. And there are definitely steps to take to make sure your cloud environment is secure. A lot of information security officers are actually looking at the cloud from a security perspective, making sure they're FISMA certified. So that's typically a certification, especially in the government space, you'll want to get. And the cloud, I think, really, it covers these multiple facets of mobility, whether it's MDM, data, testing and development. You can use it for multiple aspects. So it's a really key key technology. Yeah, mobile security. I mean, someone could give an entire session on mobile security, but some of the considerations I think certainly around CNA, and typically what happens is when you're developing an application, it has to go through some kind of accreditation and certification process where a third party or information security is testing it, doing vulnerability scanning, what have you, to make sure that there's no vulnerabilities with the app. So you can do that, after you develop the app, and a lot of times that's the approach we'll take, where we'll go through and develop the app and then run it through CNA and use tools like AppScan, Rational AppScan, Fortify is another, to do vulnerability scanning. OAuth 2 is kind of, I think, the standard for authentication these days over SAML. So, and I think that's fairly well understood, but it's nonetheless important. A lot of organizations have not moved to OAuth for authentication, so it's something that you definitely need to look at. Device authentication, we talked about that a moment ago, but it's definitely a big concern for enterprises. Use of certificates and making sure that all these devices are authenticated. There's typically a mobile security governance function that should be established that addresses hardening standards, emerging threats, all of these things, and making sure that all the appliances that they have are kept up to date and have the latest patches applied and updates to account for these emerging threats and malware. Android is obviously more problematic than I would say the other platforms, but it's definitely not alone, but it's a big one. Operations and maintenance, and there's typically a help desk component to all of this. And that is an area where you can definitely decouple and potentially outsource your entire help desk. A lot of customers will do sort of hybrid models where they have an existing help desk, and you can train them, develop help desk scripts. But others will want like more offsite tier 2 through 4 support for more advanced troubleshooting and issues. So that's an area that you can, I think, decouple. A lot of customers will use like MDM providers or even like the telco providers to deal with a lot of that. Enterprise mobile data, is another big one. There's such a dramatic influx of data from mobility that a lot of organizations are not prepared for, particularly with location and geolocation. And the question becomes, how do you store that? How is it mashed up with legacy data that exists within an organization? What is key, I think, is master data management and governance. Making sure that it aligns and integrates with an existing master data management strategy to make sure that the data is, being in the correct format, is, mashing up correctly, is going through the correct review board. So that's an area that you do want to make sure that you're in sync with. But a lot of organizations are using the cloud, to store, especially like GPS and geolocation. So they can then use the cloud to mash up, legacy data and external APIs, external data. So you're seeing a lot of that. The BI and analytics aspect is important. Dealing with the big data environments that mobile data is bringing. A lot of times, what's involved with BI and analytics is the integration with an EDW, an enterprise data warehouse, or big data environment, in-house. And a lot of customers aren't thinking about, okay, how do I now integrate the mobile data set into my existing big data environment? And so that's an area that you'll want to think about and address. So that's just some of the overview of these key pillars, some of the techniques for decoupling, some of the areas to consider. To summarize, some of the tactics, avoiding the certification of libraries and doing CNA after the app is developed. I've had customers saying, well, you're wanting to use all these JavaScript libraries, and we've got to run all these through some ITK review board. And we're saying, you'll never keep up. You cannot keep up with the change that's going to go on. It's an impossible task. So we try to move them to say, leverage what's out there in the open standards, but you can do all the CNA after the app is built. So that's, I think, a key tactic. With service implementation, you can use the existing infrastructure of a customer, but consider a technique like a mobile hub to give you like flexible, lightweight services on top of that. Use of the cloud for agile engineering, CI environments, is, I think, a key tactic. You can also use the cloud, obviously, for data. So that's a key decoupling tactic as well. Governance, the managed mobile service approach, using ITIL, I think is a really good one. It's really wise. And you can work, I think, pretty hand in hand with the customer's existing governance model that they have created. For MDM, if I was to say, should we do cloud or on-premise, I would probably recommend the cloud, to be honest. I think it's just very difficult for customers to, in reality, implement on-premise MDM solutions. Most of them prefer that, but they have to be prepared to deal with things like the upgrades of the MDM software and maintaining all that. So I don't know. I think the cloud is easier, and you still have to deal with like similar issues of ports and all that. So you can outsource help desk, and same way with mobile data. It can be stored in the cloud, but it needs to integrate with your master data management and your governance. So that's that's basically the presentation and some of the things to be thinking about for decoupling the enterprise. So are there any questions?